So howdy there, everybody, and God bless, and welcome to another episode. Yeah, I know it's late. This is Monday, not Sunday. I understand how the days work. So, life has just been very, very interesting lately. So, besides other car issues, though I did finally get my car back, which is why I'm sitting in it currently. That's why there's no background music or anything else. I'm recording straight on my phone because Scarlett's asleep and it's 4:35 in the morning. And I finally can go someplace where it's quiet. I would do it outside, but it's actually fairly loud outside with all the crickets and birds and God knows what else making noise outside. Coyotes. So I decided to go sit in the car, trying to actually get this episode up. I know I said I was going to do two, like a regular sermon and then also a discussion episode, but that's not going to happen, at least not right now. I don't have a regular sermon. I do have most of the discussion thing that I was going to do, because I was going to do like sermons and discussion episodes, but I got a little bit too into the weeds in that discussion episode, so I got pushed back, and then we had a bit of a personal family emergency. Minor, everything's okay now, but that took a lot out of me. And then yesterday, on Saturday, I had to go talk with my dad about some stuff, and I live a good bit away from me, so I had to drive there, and then I ended up talking with them, and then staying, not getting home till like 1 a.m. and whatnot. And in the meantime of all that, I somehow pulled a muscle, or strained a muscle in my neck and in my back. Can't figure out how I did that. I only felt it in my neck on Saturday, and I hurt it when I did it. That was not fun. That was not fun at all. It's still very stiff. It only hurts when I move it certain directions. But I was kind of walking around like Batman, old 80s Batman, for a while. I had to turn my whole body, can't turn my head. And then for whatever reason, my back's also hurting. So maybe I heard it at the same time. Who knows? So I took most of Sunday just to rest and try to recuperate. I got energy now because I'm awake. Because I have to go to the store here in a few hours anyway, to go do a curbside order. And I was like, let's get this done, or at least attempt it. So these are going to be a little bit different. In general, these are less formal. I'm less formal in general. I think formalities get in the way of actual. I think sometimes being formal can good, and sometimes it's just nice to be formal. But I think people focus too much on tradition, and I guess as Christ would call it, traditions of man. I think if you don't look a certain way, talk a certain way, walk a certain way, then it's not worth listening to you. They don't actually care about the content of what you're saying. Which is why you have people that do the walk and talk and all that, but what they're actually saying is vile and evil. But they're accepted because they play the weird, stupid little games. Well, my brain don't like the stupid, weird little games. Never has. It's probably why they say, probably has something to do with the autism. But these are going to be even a little bit less formal than that, because it's just a general discussion. Because I thought that'd be interesting. Because while doing this, it's not just preaching and teaching and putting the messages that are on my heart. But while reading through this 5th edition, I keep finding so much interesting information. And then new stuff's coming out, and you're reading new theses papers by scholars and theologians and whatnot. Dan McClellan's a good source. That guy's interesting in of itself because he's a Mormon, and I am very upfront about my apprehensions to Mormons. My apprehensions to cults. I was raised Pentecostal, and that gets pretty culty, but we weren't culty Pentecostals. I know everybody who's in a cult says they're not. We're not in a cult out there, but we had a lot of culty stuff, though we were kind of, oddly enough, like Texas PCG was kind of considered liberal for the longest time, mainly because they let women wear pants. But like my grandmother comes from that jean skirt wearing era, like that's all they wear. And then there are the very culty Pentecostals, and then of course there's the snake handlers and all that. But there's, even in modern relaxed stuff, there's still a lot of that culty atmosphere. and very, very dogmatic. But the Mormon church I have never trusted. I don't like cults because of what I've seen on the inside of the church, and then I definitely don't like cults from what I've seen on the outside about cults. A cult's more than just a small practice. A cult is all about control and power dynamics, and further beyond. And technically, you can get like big religions are like that too. That is very, very true. But it's not actually about helping people or helping community. It's about power, maintaining power. And the Mormon church is still like that and has always been like that. And it started poor to begin with. It started bad, right? Similar to the Seventh-day Adventist. And then when you start getting into their actual theology, it's very, very... I mean, when people think just talking about how the Bible itself... I mean, people are going to think that when we're talking about these discussions on Genesis and then a bit of Exodus, that like, oh, it's heretical and stuff like that. But except it's not. We have archaeological record, and we can read back, and we can talk to the Jews and the rabbis and stuff of what they actually believe and what they think these stories might mean and the metaphors and yada, 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 right? But then you get in the Mormons, and they get into some really weird, multiple planets, and then everybody gets their own planet, and basically like Jesus is an alien, kind of weird, really weird, almost kind of Gnostic in a way, or similar to some Gnostic religions. Very, very similar to Scientology, because Scientology is basically just Mormonism, but with more aliens. Yeah, but it's very... All this is to say, I did not expect him to be a good source. Because most people of the Latter-day Saints, now some are just going about their lives, though a lot of bad people are allowed to do bad things because people are just going about their lives. But just because you're a part of something doesn't necessarily make you 100% complicit. You're not necessarily upholding that status quo. You're not making the horrible decisions for the church, and you may even want them to change. Brian Sanderson, very popular fantasy author, he's a Mormon as well, but he has very anti-Mormon views. He's LGBT friendly, which is not a Mormon position. He seems to be okay with black people too, which is also not a very Mormon position. The Mormon, I could do episodes on episodes of my problems with the Mormon church, and then just to be fair, I could do episodes and episodes about my problems with Pentecostalism. And then Christianity as a whole, just to be fair. Because a lot of Christians like to dogpile on others, even within their own religion, just so they can make themselves seem better. That's a tactic. We're not that crazy. Look at these crazier people over here. That's just the thing. But this guy, it still claims to be a practitioner, but his thing is data over dogma. And he actually goes based off of the fact and what we know about the religion. And it's even said he doesn't touch too much on Mormonism. And some people think it's unfair, but I can understand because Mormonism is strict. I can say whatever I want about Christianity and still be part of this. No one can run me off. They could try. They would fail. But no one can actually run me off. And I don't belong to any denomination. But when you're part of churches do this on a church level, and like a church by church level, where they excommunicate people, and sometimes they can get real crazy about it. But the Mormons will go after you, and then we all know about the Scientologists. Like they will separate people from their families. So like speaking out against them, you might never see your family again. Because like your kids don't get a choice to leave the church until they're grown, and by the time they're grown, they may have forgotten about you or not even know where you are, or you could have died. It's really horrible situations. And depending on if he's part of like the main sect there in Utah, that could be a case. It could be sort of dangerous, or maybe he finds comfort in some of the Latter-day Saint beliefs. Because there are some Mormons that are just Christians, but they call themselves Mormons. They don't really delve into the weirdness of it. Kind of like a lot of Catholics. I don't know if I would say the majority, but a lot of Catholics don't really think about all the weirdness of the Catholic Church, or even believe in most of the dogmatic stuff of the Catholic Church. Like a lot of the literal craziness that's in the Catholic Church that doesn't really have any Christian or biblical basis. That is all just kind of set up to maintain a power structure and a hierarchy over people. They don't actually believe in all that, and the pastors and the priests don't even talk about it because they know if they would bring it up, people would go, "That's insane. That's what our church actually believes. That's crazy." So they try not to talk about it. So I don't know. But usually when they're Mormon, even when they mean well, they are still trying to get a narrative, or preach a narrative, and have a bias. And that bias is usually Mormon friendly. And anything that's Mormon friendly, I don't agree with, because Mormons are sneaky. Just like a lot of fundamentalists and evangelicals are sneaky. They can appear to be your friend, and then they get you in, and then they start making you hate other people so they can subjugate those people and oppress. But I don't want to say preaches, because he's not a preacher. He is a biblical scholar, and the work that he does is 100% against the tradition of the LDS. That would be considered heresy by them, and they would take that very, very seriously. Now, he's not openly speaking out against the church, so that may be what saves him. But he also used to be employed by them and is currently no longer. And that might have had something to do with it, as he kept bringing stuff up as a biblical scholar, being like, "That's not true." And they would be like, "But that's what we believe, or that's what we say." And he goes, "But that's not true." And that probably caused some butting heads. So I find that very interesting that he's still a Mormon. But people also find it interesting that I am the way that I am, that I believe and talk about the things that I believe, and I talk about all the science and the archaeology and the history, and talk about how most of these stories aren't real and all that, and they think, "Oh, you must be an atheist." And I'm like, "What? God, no. I love Jesus Christ." And like, "How can you, but you said all of it's fake." I said, "I didn't say all of it was fake. I didn't really say any of it was fake." And what we're going to talk about these discussions is that these stories are not literal, and they weren't written how most people are taught that how they were written. And a lot of times they were written with a purpose, a different purpose, some purposes that have been lost to time that we'll never know. And like Genesis was not written. I mean, we might as well dive right into it. But anyway, Dan McClellan is a great resource. He has TikTok, YouTube, all the good stuff. He has a great podcast, Data Over Dogma, where they talk about a lot of these things. And he's not telling you to believe one way or the other. He's not telling you to not believe in Jesus, because he himself believes in Jesus Christ. What he's doing is these are the facts. These are what we know. And that's it. So he knows, like, if your church is telling you this and it's not what the facts are, it doesn't matter. That believing in facts has not changed Jesus' message. Facts do not change Christ, or his love, or his sacrifice, or what we are commanded to do. Facts only change the dogma of what the church wants you to do. And that can be a church literally on a one church level, or on an organizational level, or on a religious level, like, something as big as like the Catholic Church, and so on and so forth. But just like if a church starts saying 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, they start saying it equals 3 or 5. Just because they say it doesn't mean that that's right. They could put that in their dogma and all their stuff, but we know 2 + 2 = 4. That's a fact. That fact does not change any of Jesus' message, and it has nothing to do with Christ. It has nothing to do with God. That's just something that they wanted to stupid stuff that they want to say. That's all that it is. It's man being man. Man being man. That's all it is. But check them out. Very, very interesting, along with a lot of other any other scholarly work. What's great about this particular Bible, this 5th edition of the Oxford Bible, is it has a lot of, it's a very, very plain translation, and then underneath the scripture, it is like, here's the meaning behind this, here's where it was written, here's why it's written a certain way, here's the earliest manuscripts we might have, it could also mean this, here's, so on and so forth. Gives you all that context that makes it so much more interesting, and gives you the ability to understand why this was written, what these people were going through. Man is fallible. Always has been. We are not perfect. Even if it's inspired by the Lord, we're going to screw it up. That's just how it works. And there's story upon story in the Bible of God giving us something. Giving us... And I find this hilarious. And this is probably... That's why I do believe that that the Bible is inspired by God. I do believe that. Doesn't mean that the Bible is right, or that all of it is right. Because that's not how that works. Because God has inspired many people. That inspiration is godly, and that's why we can get a lot of the stories and meanings out of these scriptures, even if most of the meaning doesn't apply today, even if some of that meaning's been lost to time, or is meant for a certain people, so on and so forth. But the Bible's not the only God-inspired work, and that God has inspired many people to do anything. But just because He inspires somebody does not mean that they take that inspiration and do good with it. Just because He inspires somebody does not mean that they take that inspiration and do good with it. What they choose to do with it is up to them. Because of the whole free will. But He gives them the inspiration. He gives them this. He gives them everything they need. And then they may go and screw it up. And sometimes that in itself is the test. When we talk about tests from God, we think about horrible things happening and how we react to those horrible situations. But more often than not, God's going to do something good to you. And how are you going to react? Look at all these billionaires. Do you think that's not a test that's going to come up? God's going to be, look what all these riches that I've blessed you with, and look what you've done with it. Nothing. Well, I created this, I created that. It's like, did you create that? Did you actually do that? Here's a list, an unnumbered list of all the people who have suffered and died that you could have helped, whose deaths, whose suffering you could have directly stopped, and you still would have been one of the richest people in the world. You wouldn't have to given up everything to help, and you chose not to. Here are people that you directly met and did nothing, and you turned away. That's gonna happen. Like that. You want to talk about a test? No, they're not going to get tested like Job. They're gonna get tested a different way. They're gonna be tested like the rich man who came before Jesus, saying, "What else do I have to give? I've done all this. I followed all your commandments." And He said, "Sell all your things and then follow me." And he walked away sad, and he couldn't do it. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about Genesis. And also part of Exodus. So it's going to be a little fragmented. Because I took notes over several days as I was getting into it. And then also got into bits of Exodus. Because when the law was being shaped, when it started to actually be shaped, it was being shaped more or less around the same time. But these stories were not made at the same time. But when they started compiling them, certain narratives were made around the same time. That would be around the Babylonian exile. But not everything. There's very, very old parts of Genesis. Really old parts. And then there's parts that are fairly new. That were written around the Babylonian exile. But there are parts of it. Like the original In the Beginning, I believe, is one of the oldest parts of the book. But the Abraham story is not. And they believe the entire Abraham narrative may have been written during the Babylonian exile. Did not exist prior to that. And that can be earth-shattering to some people. And that can hurt some people who believed that this thing is infallible. That it has all this great meaning and so on and so forth. And it's because of how they were taught. Deprogramming is difficult. But a lot of Jews and a lot of Judaism doesn't preach the law that way. They see it as very metaphorical. They don't teach it. So when these new revelations might show up, you don't see the Jewish community at large reacting harshly. And being like, that can't be true. They don't necessarily revolt against it. It's because they weren't taught that way. And they don't put their entire belief on these stories. Now, the laws themselves are different, but they don't build themselves up on the stories believing that this is true and believing that if any word of it isn't true, then that means it's all lies. That's all untrue. And that their whole life is a lie. So when you see people people that you believe could be, who believe in hateful things, but you know that's out of character for them. And you're like, man, what? But why do you believe these hateful things when you're so nice? And I've seen you help people, and I know that you have a good soul. And why would you believe these hateful things? Like, because it's in the Bible. It's because they cling to that because they were raised to believe it. And it goes on a deeper level than just regular brainwashing. A deeper level than just a lot of the systematic racism. Though it's similar because we're taught very similar things about our own country. about how these systems of our laws work, and that they've always been. That's why you see certain politicians not doing anything when they're in certain crises, because they think that the nation's just going to be okay, or that a bad person can't do a bad thing that they're talking about, because, oh, well, we have checks and balances and blah blah blah. But the checks and balances only work if you check someone and then balance it. They don't just do it by themselves. But we believe that these systems are somehow supernatural, or not even supernatural, are alive, and will just do things by themselves without us having to do without us having any input. And with religion, it's more so because we do believe in this greater being, in this God. So, and with religion, I've sort of understood. I've never understood it with political systems in any country. If people treat it that way, because we know it's not of God. Man did it. We know who did it. They drew up the document and then signed it. Like, we know who did it. There's paintings of these guys. They named the country. Like, the first system they had didn't even work, and they had a rebellion shortly after the first revolution, and then they had to come up with a new system, which is how we got the Constitution. Like, these are not. God did not come down from heaven and write and then like, oh yeah, here's all these decrees, and then I have all these angels that are going to make it all work, and it's all magical. No, it's dudes that did it, random dudes, and they did it over 200 years ago. Why would we just? And they did it even then, assuming that they wrote all these things out for people to follow. But in order for it to work, you have to follow it. Like, stuff has to be enforced. Like, it doesn't just magically happen. But with religion, you do have somewhat sort of that magical thinking. But you have these people that are raised that all of these words have to be true. All of these words. And that if any of them is wrong, then it's a lie. And that shakes them, because when when you're telling them, well, this isn't right, or this is wrong, or this is wrong, and it's obviously wrong, even little things, if they believe that one thing is wrong, then their whole entire worldview will fall apart. And that's too much to take for them. But you don't see that from other communities like the Jewish community, because they don't believe that way. Or many of them don't. There are some, but many of them don't, because they're like, of course, well, these stories aren't literal. This is that, or they wrote it because this time this was actually a different sect of Jews that wrote that, believed that, which is why it changed when you get to this book, and so on and so forth. And that's how it's supposed to be understood. But when you raise people from a kid that if one thing falls, then the whole thing does, like dominoes, then they start freaking out. Even if they would like to not be racist or hateful or homophobic or certain things like that. Even they're like, well, actually, I wouldn't want to be that, but I have to, because they think their entire world will fall apart. And I understand that to a point. Because even when I started getting real into this and started doing the study and said, I'm actually going to start preaching. I did have some, I've read a lot, but I've always read these different translations. I never really read into the context. And I've always been skeptical, and I've always looked up, like, a lot of the context, sometimes the meanings. I've always known that for a long time I've known that Jesus' name isn't really Jesus. It's technically Joshua, or Yeshua, but its English version would be Joshua. So on and so forth. And stuff like that. And some people have a hard time accepting that. But I don't. To me, it's like, oh, we have new information. That doesn't change anything about Jesus. It doesn't change anything about Christ. But it just changes their religion. That's okay. It just changes part about the religion. It changes part of how we talk about it. That's okay. Their religion was different before Christ showed up. And he was one of those big changes. I mean, change is okay. Change is never a bad thing. And I am change adverse. I have autism, guys. But unnecessary change is what gets me. And big, traumatic changes. It hurts. But when I would see these changes in the Bible, I wouldn't think, oh, it's all fake. Oh, time to be an atheist now, or my whole life's going to fall apart. I would just be like, oh, that's interesting. But I know Christ is alive, or alive in heaven. I know he's the Son of God. I know who God is. I know who the Holy Spirit is. I know all this love and how we're supposed to be compassionate and all that. But of course, I'm a writer as well, and I know that you can write something down and think, I also have a communication disorder. It's the simplest way to sum up autism. Communication and executive function disorder. But, and I understand that you can write something down and think, oh, I got this clear. And then come back and look at it the next day and be like, oh man, that was not a clear message at all. Or you can be talking to someone thinking they're on your same wavelength, and then you offended them or scared them, or something wrong has happened because of some miscue. And that's in just day-to-day life. Now imagine you wrote something 5,000 years ago, and now it's been translated into so many different languages, and it was based off oral stories, so stories that weren't written down in the first place, and then started getting written down. And then all the translations, all the changes. You ever played the game of telephone? Well, one, you had these oral traditions that changed every time someone told it. And then when they finally started writing stuff down, that's when they got changed for the last time, or sort of for the last time. The changes would then come later. Other changes would come later, like in Genesis, when they, because it's being written by several different people, and they got compiled into one book, trying to tell similar stories. And it's very obvious when you read it plainly, that these are, because you'll read the same thing over and over again, and you'll be like, didn't I just read this story? And it's because it's being told sometimes with very similar, very little changes, sometimes with very big changes. A lot of the big narratives, there used to not be a flood narrative, and all of a sudden there is, and then so on and so forth. It's very, very, very strange. And it's a lot for people to take in. And it was kind of a lot back then. So you do all this, and then thousands of years go by. You think there's not going to be some stuff that's lost, maybe in translation, lost to time, so on and so forth, and there has. Which is why the archaeological record is so important, to go back and see, what were these people doing, what's going on, who were these people, why maybe they did this. Because we know not every law they had, even though they thought it was of God, is of God. Because Jesus kind of turned around and said that. He talked about the traditions of man. And there were a lot of them. He's like, well, these are of the law. It's like, no, these are traditions of man. God never said this. I never did that. But you said it was, because it was the church that said it. So I kind of got into a sermon in the middle of that, which is good. That's good. Get a little bit more out of this. But we can get more into discussion on Genesis. So I just kind of go through my notes here. So, what's my first note here? So I said, Earth in ancient Hebrew is a feminine noun. Earth is seen as a woman, Mother Earth, like in many other cultures. Interesting. So yes, that was one of the annotations here. And when I was reading through Genesis in the NRSV, it talks about how even in early Hebrew and Proto-Hebrew, Earth, the word we use for planet Earth, is a feminine noun. So the old culture of back in Canaan at the time, they still, they had, what do I want to say? You ever heard Mother Earth, Gaia and all that? They had the similar view, which is something that was kind of prevalent throughout all cultures, seeing Earth as a woman, Earth as a mother, Earth as feminine. And that is how Earth is talked about in Genesis, especially when God is creating it. In Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image." And it's just until it was pointed out, I never thought about it before. I never realized that before, that God is talking to someone else in the story. Possibly another or multiple gods. Turns out, yes, he is talking to multiple gods, because there's this thing that pops up later in the Old Testament called the Divine Council. Because old school Judaism, or this old religion of Canaan, Canaanite religion, which is where the Jews come from, there is no monotheism in the Bible. And monotheism as in there is only one God and only has ever been one God. That's not in the Bible. Not even in the New Testament. What there is that our God is the only one that should be worshipped because our God is better than everybody else's God. And our God can beat up your God. But even when God speaks, he directly mentions other gods, even ones that he's against, telling us not to worship or have idols to them because he's a jealous God. That's how they characterize him, as being jealous and vain. A lot of weird characterizations of God, which is also something I don't think that God actually said when he's talking bad about himself. I think that's definitely a human hand, where he calls himself vain and jealous, and I'm doing things for my own glory, and kind of talk about how he doesn't care about people. That doesn't sound like something God would say, for several different reasons. It doesn't sound like something you would say if you wanted people to follow you or worship you. It does, however, sound like somebody who's a little mad at the God they worship and is maybe portraying them in not the best light, but still believes and worships them. But it's like, I'll show you, this is how I think you talk. But also, if you really like that macho alpha stuff, or this He-Man approach that I'm above I'm my own glory, I'm strong, I'm bad, and whatever, that stuff that's very prevalent in internet culture today still, then you might write God that way. Even though, by a lot of God's actions, he is the opposite of that. But it also depends on who is writing that story, because not everyone who believes in God likes God. Which is something I don't think a lot of us realize, that not everybody who's writing about God likes him. They may worship him, they may even love him, but they don't particularly like him. The Jews have a very interesting relationship that's different than Christianity, where they argue. They have an argumentative culture. And we can talk about whether some of it is toxic or not, or all that, whether that's a good thing or not. But when I mean argue, I don't mean yelling at each other. Because some of that's bad. You shouldn't be yelling at each other just to yell. But they have a discussionary culture, where they will argue. And even in the books, even in the ones where they're seeing God walk around, there's arguing with God. And not in the parts where, like, God will tell them to do something, they just won't do it, or they'll do the opposite, or they do that all the time in Exodus. Only get this much manna, or the rest of it's gonna mold. And then they go, okay, and then do it anyway. It's like, don't go out on the Sabbath because there's not going to be any, and people go out anyway. And it's like, why are you not listening? But I mean, like, they're questioning him even and asserting their own autonomy. They want answers. They don't just want to be blind, and they're arguing but being respectful. Like Job's whole thing is, he does argue with God. He is angry with God. He just doesn't curse him. He chooses not to curse and die. But he wants to know why his kids were killed. He wants to know why this happened to him. And there's this whole thing about, like, if it happened to me, what was the whole point of me doing all this? But we've already talked all that about Job. I'm going to talk more about him later. But the divine council, as there's a divine council or heavenly court, and they believed in that because God was seen as El, and El was, even Abraham refers to him as El Elyon. Was it El Elyon or something like that, which means God Most High. He's the highest God. And then he has many sons below him and other heavenly creatures, because there's the angels, but not everything we call an angel today is actually described as an angel. An angel is very specific, but like a cherub isn't necessarily an angel. They're just other heavenly creatures. And then in the, like, Canaan pantheon, there's a lot of gods, like Baal and stuff. And Yahweh, when they start calling him Yahweh, is very, very similar to Baal. And they wonder if maybe a lot of those stories were just kind of carried over from Baal or not. But a lot of people have trouble with that, thinking about the other gods or other divine beings in heaven, and understanding that our religion, Christianity and Judaism, has never been monotheistic. But it makes perfect sense to me, and always has, because when Jesus shows up even when he comes back. When he comes back and finally reveals his divinity, he doesn't say that he's God. He says, I'm the Son of God. And that's what we believe, he's the Son of God. And then there are these people who's like, well, he can't be the Son because God can't have children. And then we get this Trinity thing where he's somehow like three people at once. But he prays to God and calls him the Father. And then when they talk about the end of the days, they said no one knows the time, the date or time. Not all the angels of heaven, the Holy Spirit, not even the Son, only the Father. So, and he talks to him like he is three separate beings. And, of course, that makes sense because he's his son. It's like, well, does that mean God had sex or whatever? I don't know. Ask him. He might tell you. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't. But if he created us the way he did and supposedly created all the angels, why couldn't he also created a kid? Why is that different? Why would that be different? It doesn't outright say a lot of this stuff. Mainly because it's not important. It's not important. But people get hung up on that, and I don't necessarily know why. None of that disproves his holiness, his goodness, his love, or any of that. It doesn't disprove Christianity or anything. Muslims are very, very monotheistic. They don't like that, even though it's based off of religion that did not start out monotheistic. And still really isn't monotheistic. It's there was another word for it. We only worship one God. And even Jesus says to only worship the Father. But we're not monotheistic in that only one God exists. Because throughout the Old and New Testament, they're very, very clear that more than one exists. Or what we would consider gods exist. But there's only one that we're supposed to worship. There's only one Father. There's only one Creator. There's only one above all. And they used to call him El, and then they kind of changed Adonai, Yahweh, so on and so forth. But for a lot of it, he had a divine council. When he goes to the Tower of Babel, or when he goes to Babel and he separates them all, he says, he's talking to someone else. He says us, and he says, we have to go down there, we have to stop them. And he uses we and us a lot whenever God talks in Genesis. And there's parts of it in Exodus and Deuteronomy and throughout the Old Testament. And I just never realized that how often he's talking to other people. Because there are moments where God is only there by himself. And then there are these other moments where he's talking to someone else. There's also, of course, his wife Asherah, which pops up, I believe, one time in the Old Testament. And that comes from the old Canaanite religion. Because Genesis has two sources. Because Genesis is also a compilation of different stories that were compiled over time, much like the Bible. But Genesis has many sources, two main source types telling similarly different stories: a priestly and Yahwistic source, or like your primeval sources. I noted that in Genesis 4:22, it says that Tubal-Cain made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. He's kind of like the father of blacksmithing. The problem with this here, and it lets you know that whoever wrote this was not writing it at the beginning of time or whatever. Because they mention iron tools. Well, whoever wrote this was aware of iron tools, which wouldn't have been available until the Iron Age, the very earliest of 1200 BC. Now, there were some iron tools before that. They didn't call it iron, but it was meteoric iron. So they were only iron sources that came from meteors. So like there's some like meteoric blades and stuff like that. But not a blacksmith making iron tools, because they did not have that yet. We hadn't come to the Iron Age. Because Tubal-Cain is supposed to be before the flood. So we did not have iron. So whoever wrote that definitely wrote it after the Iron Age. Even though this is supposed to be this particular part in the story is before the flood. Just very interesting. I mean, this wouldn't even have been written during the time of Moses, depending on where you place Moses, because the Iron Age would have to happen. Let's see here. The Yahwistic sources don't have a flood narrative. That's something that was added later. Then we get a mention of the Nephilim. Last book I wrote features them pretty prominently. They're first talked about as good things. And I swear that when the Bible talked about them, or at least a lot of the preaching I've seen on it talks about, because they become the giants, and then David and Goliath and all that stuff. But when it mentions them first in Genesis, because the Nephilim are the sons and daughters, or the offspring of angels and humans. But Genesis, it says that they're good things, which is interesting. Genesis 6:4 says they were to be great heroes. That's just something I've never saw before. That the not giants necessarily, but the Nephilim were supposed to be like the great heroes. Our legends and stuff are all Nephilim. The sons of angels. Interesting. More references to God working with other gods. Let us go down and confuse their language. I did the whole Tower of Babel story already. A parable about how humanity united can accomplish anything. Then, something that popped up. So there's King, I'm going to butcher this name, Melchizedek. He meets Abraham at one point, and they talk, and they're both talking about El Elyon, God Most High. And it says he is the king of Salem. This is what they call Jerusalem. It's just a shortening of Jerusalem. So apparently, according to this part in Genesis, Jerusalem was already a well-established kingdom in Abraham's life, which is very, very interesting. Very interesting. Because I don't know if Jerusalem itself is that old. Because this would have been, before Babylon? At that point in time in Genesis? So that's interesting. Jerusalem at this time, if it is, depending on how old it is, Jerusalem would have worshipped El and would have been part of that Canaanite religion. El Elyon, God Most High. And El is used to refer to God. And then sometimes it's used to refer to Yahweh. Because at some point in time, they changed from calling him El to start calling him Yahweh. And then Abraham says that he believes in the same God, calls him El, and then says that he has made a promise to El. And they are worshiping the same God. And that's also where we get to El Shaddai. Which, when I was looking at the annotations, it says El Shaddai can translate to many different things. So we usually see it as like God Almighty. But it can also mean like God of the mountains or fertile God. But its literal translation is God with breasts. And there's other, depending on who is writing it, they speak of God in a feminine, I was going to say tone, but that's not the right word. They use either feminine, like, instead of viewing him as like the father, they view him as the mother. So it's more, the way that they see God is either, and for a while, God is not supposed to have a gender. They call him the Father purely because of the concept of him being the creator of all and him being the father of creation. And them seeing the fathers as the head of the household. But God and even angels and such are not supposed to have gender. They're supposed to be spirits. And they don't have a gender like we do, or a sex like we do. Or gender, I guess they could decide whatever they want it to be. And angels did, because they had children. And I know there's stuff in like demonology and stuff where they talk about how they may have been able to like, there's stuff where it talks about Lucifer being able to make himself into an angel of light, so that some angels may have had the ability to transform and like give themselves certain sexual organs depending on who wanted to carry the child. Stuff like that, right? There's not much of that in the Bible itself, but that, that's all speculation because people are wondering how this would have worked. But when we talk about the actual angels themselves, they usually are even depicted in paintings as being fairly androgynous, having both male and female features. Usually all that, also like that long hair and stuff. And I've always thought that was interesting, that they do the same thing with God. Sometimes he's father, sometimes they kind of see him more as mother. They don't care, he's the creator and he's the most high. And all of these things that they refer to them as is it's of or out of honor, out of respect. But yeah, I didn't realize that El Shaddai like literally is God with breasts, and it's like, what exactly does that mean? And they think it's like fertile God or God of the mountains, because there's Mount Sinai and Mount Oeb, and which is God's like mountain that he likes to go to, and they're like, and also could have been where the people lived. They were like in a mountainous region, so like it was their God of the mountains. Just interesting. I've never seen that literal translation before. So I got here some math that I did. It said that 400 shekels of silver. Said it, in the annotation said it would have weighed about 10 pounds, because that's what he paid for to bury his wife. I believe it was Abraham. He bought like a burial plot. They wanted to just give it to him free, but he's like, no, make me pay it. And then just for fun, I was like, how much would that cost today? It's like 10 pounds of silver. So I did 10 pounds of silver. Did it by troy ounces. That's about like $4,900 at that day, and March 20th silver prices. And I was like, well, how much land did he get? And it's kind of hard. I looked it up, and it's like, we don't know exactly where it is. We know there was a cave. We don't know exactly how much land it was. But I just wanted to do that. Just I want to see like how good of a deal he got. Because, I mean, less than $5,000 for it. I mean, if it's at least an acre, that's pretty good. I mean, last time I checked on an acre of land where I'm from, back at my hometown, it was like 13 grand. So yeah, pretty good deal. But 10 pounds of silver, that's a lot of silver to be just walking around with. Let's see, Genesis 34 tells the story of Dinah's brothers. Oh yeah, so Dinah, one of these daughters of Jacob, who then becomes Israel, gets raped, and her brothers take revenge. They trick and kill the rapist, but not just the rapists, all the men in town. They go a little bit far, but they say it's that all the men conspired to do that against their sister. Now, technically speaking, that would have been against Jewish law. If they were following the laws that then come later in Exodus, but is either against it, or they didn't care for it, or the law didn't exist yet. Not 100% sure. All we know is that Jacob didn't really seem to care about what happened to his daughter, but he was mad about what his sons did, and that he thought it was going to bring violence against them. But he didn't care that anything happened to his daughter, which is awful, because she was violently raped, and that's really, really, really terrible. Unfortunately, that's a theme that's going to happen. Terrible things are going to happen to women, and men are not going to care about until Jesus shows up, which that's just the horrible culture that they had. Oh yeah, I mentioned that one of the clans born to Esau is one of the sons that then has his own clan, has a similar spelling to Jesus. And I didn't look that up. I wanted to look it up and see if because the way Hebrew works, and then the way these stories work, especially as they're being written, and then even later on, the later writers in the New Testament, is everything has like a weird double secret meaning. Even individual letters can have a weird double meaning. So I was like, does that have something to do with the Messiah message that comes later? Or, depending on who added this or what? I just thought it was interesting. It's like Jeush is what that clan is called. Jeush. So in Genesis 38, they were going to burn a pregnant woman for adultery, which is not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to stone her, but also they knew she was pregnant and did not care. There is no care for the woman or her unborn child. She also didn't commit adultery. That's also the thing that she did not do. And then, she doesn't get burned. It's Tamara. There's a whole weird story about her pretending to be a prostitute. Very interesting. So something I learned about adultery is, what do you think about when you hear adultery? What is the crime of adultery? It's cheating on your spouse, right? No. So if you're married to a woman and you want to go have sex with another woman, whether you can do that, apparently. That's not considered adultery. Whether your wife consents or not, because your wife doesn't have the ability to consent under the law. Which kind of makes sense. How else were you going to get another wife without cheating on your wife? I always wondered that. And also have concubines, which is just a woman that lives in your house that you have sex with. And you could go see prostitutes. That was not forbidden. It was forbidden for Jewish women to become prostitutes, but not everybody was Jewish. So you could go see Gentile prostitutes, and that was fine. The only thing you couldn't do was sleep with someone else's wife. That would be adultery. And that would be punishable. But you could... technically, a man could do whatever he wanted. It was, it's man's world. And that's not considered cheating. Cheating is not what adultery is. Adultery is very specific. Which is really, really interesting. And also in that story of the rape, they don't mention how the Lord feels. The Lord is kind of absent for a little bit. And children of Israel, when you think of children of Israel, a lot of people probably think about the Jews, the Jewish people. And they're not necessarily wrong in that, but when the Bible, at least in these early parts, talks about children of Israel, it's literal. Because Jacob's name becomes Israel. And then he has a lot of children. And it's talking about those children and their offspring. They are literally the children of Israel. It's like I'd be the children of Jim. That would be my clan. I'm one of the children of Jim. That's who I would be. And I think about that. And that changes a lot of context. And a lot of the stories that we may have been taught. Because it's not talking about a land or a specific, or the Jewish people as a whole. It's talking about this specific group. Another thing I learned was, Abraham had a lot of different kids. And also, after his first wife died, he got another wife and had kids with them. And those kids had their own offspring and had their own clans. So there's the Midians, and they're supposed to be directly related to Abraham and supposed to come from his second wife. So despite most likely following the same practices and everything, because they were raised by the same guy. Now, yes, some people are like, but Abraham wasn't actually real. It's a metaphor. I understand that. But in the story, they say that all their people came from. These guys here were supposed to be from Abraham, who would have raised them the same way and circumcised and did all that because God told him that was part of the covenant. And they would have had all this. They're not considered Jewish. So Jewish is only from the line from Abraham's first wife, specifically focusing on Isaac. How does that make any sense? It's the same practices, same everything, and I wonder if that has something to do with because of the land of Canaan. There were more than just those people the people that we know now. Because even then. And even in the stories and the reason, because there's two different sources in Genesis, but it's also you have the northern tribes, you have the hill country tribe, and they had all very different but similar stories. And then the southern tribe and everything, and then apparently Jerusalem was doing its own separate thing, but all believing in the same God, at least in part. Let me see here. What else I have? Oh, yeah. Genesis 47 mentions the lamb of Ramesses. So whoever wrote that couldn't have written it. Because that would be talking about the Pharaoh. And Ramses I didn't become Pharaoh until, 13th century? So that would have been the earliest. So they wouldn't have named it after him. Unless it could be... It could be just saying the son, because it's supposed to be, the son of Ra. But even then, it would have been a person. Usually the Pharaoh. So that was one of the pharaohs. That land, we don't know where it is. But we just call it the land of Ramesses. Another thing I thought is, you may have heard the misconception that the Jews, when they were slaves in Egypt, built the pyramids. Not true. So for the story of Moses, sometimes they do think it's Ramses II who would have been the Pharaoh, though the Pharaoh is never named. Regardless, that Exodus story does not take place during the pyramids. It also doesn't talk about the pyramids. They're building supply cities, and what the book actually says. So it has nothing to do with the pyramids. Pyramids are never even mentioned. But the pyramids began construction 2700 BC. So, long while. Long while. Just in case some people didn't realize. I don't know where that misconception got started, because it's not in the Bible either. So like the earliest parts of Genesis were written down for the first time around the 10th century BC, but come from oral traditions that were much older. However, much of Genesis, including the Abraham story, didn't enter until about, what is that? It says until 586 BC. So that's only, 586 years before Christ is born. So that's pretty recent, because that would have been around, the Babylonian exile, or right before it. Because much of this was compiled during the Babylonian exile, and that also would have been after, I believe, King David and Solomon. So let's see here. So yeah, Genesis 49. It's what Simeon and Levi get cursed for their violent nature, and it mentions of them defending their sister, and it's the reason they got cursed. That's a weird thing to curse them for. But they're not cursed by God. They're cursed by their father. God's absent in a lot of this story. So you had 12 sons, which can kind of go to the 12 tribes. They don't necessarily represent all the tribes of Jewish or Jewish-related people, because Abraham had a lot of different sons, and they had a lot of different offspring. The stele erected in 1209 BC by Pharaoh Meneptah, whatever. Names are hard, right? Has the first mention of Israel outside of the Bible. So that would have been 1209 BC. But we don't know if that's mentioning the Exodus, because there's no real evidence for the Exodus, at least not the way the Bible tells it. So the Exodus likely didn't happen, and there likely wasn't a Moses, or at least not a guy named Moses. He might have had a different name, might have got changed after oral tradition so long. It could have been, there were several different little exoduses of some Jewish people leaving, having a revolt, but nothing huge like the book mentions. However, if we go back, hold on. There's an explanation for the Exodus story. So there's the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were forced into Babylon to be exiled in Babylon. So you got, that's the time when a lot of the Torah was compiled and written. So the Exodus story could have been a metaphor for that exile, using stories from older traditions and maybe other things that they heard, maybe about, remember when this little sect left Egypt, and so on and so forth. There's also the belief that the Exodus could be referencing in part, where did I write it down? Another what is their name? What is their name? Blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, Genesis also said it was that the Jews would be in Egypt for 400 years, but Exodus says 430. Don't know where that extra 30 comes from. So yeah, we're past Genesis, and we're into just talking about some of the things I noticed about Exodus as I'm reading through it. But what was that? There we go, the Hyssocks, which are very, very old. So there was this Hyssocks, which were a group of Canaanite shepherd kings, or at least that's what they were called, with Levantine origins. It's probably possible being a part of the Levite people. And they were in Egypt a long, long, long time ago. So they could have, even during, they took over Egypt in 1785 BC and were there until about the 1550s. So there's an idea that maybe the Exodus story is taking from that. What's weird about this particular story is they were driven out of Egypt. There was no let my people go, we're being oppressed narrative there. They took over a good part of Egypt and were there for a long time, and then a pharaoh rose up, Ahmose, Ahmose the first, which I also wonder if maybe that's where they're getting Moses, at least in part, in the 1550s, and he drove them out. He drove them out of the land. And I mean, if you took that story, I mean, they're obviously, and they were known as being oppressors, and they were not particularly good in their role. What's interesting about this is this kind of lines up with Joseph, because he showed up, he was put into slavery wrongly, and then he ends up becoming one of Pharaoh's trusted advisor, gets a lot of power. They go through that famine, yada, yada, yada. And then is kind of sitting up, he's pretty much next in power to Pharaoh. And they talk, it's a coat of many colors and all that. And apparently there's some paintings or some hieroglyphics of the Hyksos, these shepherd kings, and they are shown with these colorful coats. So it could be that this Exodus story and that part of that Genesis story are talking about these same people. Now, the Hyksos rise to power and then are there for a few hundred years and then are driven out by a new Pharaoh who drives them out of the land because they were apparently not very good leaders and kind of cruel, at least how the Egyptians talk about them. But they were driven out. They were not slaves that demanded their release. They were driven out. They were in power. So if you took that and then you took the stories of smaller groups of Jews who may have been enslaved or oppressed, who then left and may have been oppressed because of the bad feelings that they had, that the Egyptians had after the Hyksos, and they're like, you're a part of those people, well, we're going to treat you poorly, or something like that, who then left. So you mix it with that, along with the Babylonian exile, you get an Exodus narrative. That's very possible, because the Exodus narrative as it stands didn't happen. There's no evidence for it. None. And it couldn't have happened. If it did happen the way that the book says it, Egypt doesn't exist today, because its population would have been just utterly decimated. All the plagues that happened, plus all the firstborns getting killed, and then it even says that the Jews at the time outnumbered their own people, so then most of Egypt leaves. Like, that was a problem. That would have decimated them. And it also doesn't make sense for it to be during the time of Ramses II, because he was very prosperous and was known for like a very peaceful and one of the most prosperous times in all of Egypt history. If that had happened in the middle of his reign, it would not have been known that, because it would have caused there would have been a real big, there would have been an economic collapse. There would probably have been famines and such. It wouldn't have been good. However, speaking of which, do you know when there was like an economic collapse and when there were these famines? Well, the story of Joseph in Genesis talks about famines, and that's what he helps out with his visions and his dreams, and he helps pretty much save Egypt, and that's how he gets into such a high power. Well, the Hyksos also were around in the area before they took power and during famines, and there were famines during their reign, and there was a bit of an economic collapse during their reign and when they got run out, and then Egypt had to rebuild itself, and we do have a good record of that. So that could make sense. So it could just be that the story is being told backwards, or it's an amalgamation of a bunch of other stories, because they were not the good guys in that story, at least according to Egyptian sources. So that seems to be that seems to be more likely. But that's about all I got for Genesis. It's interesting. You're reading this book, and it's when it's written plainly, it's so easy to see that it's written by like 4 different people, or more than that, over hundreds of years, because you'll get like you'll see the same story over and over and over again. Sometimes with slight changes, sometimes with very drastically different changes. And it's interesting just to know that. But yeah, that's we're over an hour. I've rambled a lot. It's just a little fun talk. We're gonna have more traditional stuff. I will do the sermons. I just have to come up with something. You kind of got one in the middle of this. But yeah, once I'm through Exodus, I have some more notes about it. I thought I was going to have more notes about Genesis, but once you get to a certain point, it's just, there's not really a whole lot to talk about. I wasn't really inspired to talk about much, and I didn't find a lot more interesting, which is why I started reading more into Exodus and researching it, because then I found out a lot of other stuff that made parts of Exodus more interesting. And then parts of Genesis more interesting, and then relate more to Exodus, like with Joseph and his coat, and then how he may have been one of the Hyksos, or that story might be talking about the Hyksos, along with the entire Exodus Exodus story in general. But we're going to get more on Exodus later in discussion once I get through it, and then a little bit into the next book and do some more research. But until then, bless you. Hope you have a great day and continue to have great days and blessed days. And may the Lord always look out for you and bless you and have your best interest in mind and lead you and guide you. In Jesus' name, amen. And if you need to reach out, you can reach us at sermontimemail@gmail.com. And you can always go to our Ko-Fi or Coffee or however you want to say it and donate there, or submit questions, or even listen to the other episode, whatever you want. There will be links in the description. Other than that, we hope y'all have a great day, and we'll see y'all in the next one. God bless.